Welcome to Clandestine Cases.
It was the final waltz of the winter ball at Grangewood Hall, a night thick with glitter and polite laughter, when the music fell silent in the middle of a crescendo. The grand chandelier above the ballroom trembled slightly, disturbed by some unseen force, or perhaps by the collective intake of breath as a scream echoed from the upper corridor. The guests froze, ladies clutched pearls, and gentlemen lowered their glasses. A footman dashed up the spiral staircase, his polished shoes echoing against marble. A moment later he returned, pale and shaking, his voice quivering as he spoke, to Lord Haverton. "Sir Lionel March is dead, in the study." No one had seen him leave the ballroom. He had been there only moments ago, dancing with Lady Devlin, his laughter carrying easily over the orchestra. But now only his body remained, slumped in the leather chair of the old study, his hand still curled as if gripping something, though nothing was in it. A small cut on his neck was the only visible injury, precise, barely an inch long, like a single stroke from a scalpel. Not a drop of blood elsewhere. No signs of struggle, and curiously, the fire in the hearth still crackled gently, casting soft light over the polished floor and the rows of unread books lining the walls. The door had been locked from the inside, or so claimed the butler, who had to fetch a key from the opposite end of the estate to open it. There was no other exit. The windows were shut and latched from within. No sign of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. The only object out of place was a half-melted wax figure on the mantelpiece, unremarkable save for its sudden, inexplicable presence in a room where every ornament was catalogued and accounted for. Scotland Yard was summoned immediately, but so was another name, whispered first by Lady Haverton, then passed from ear to ear among the rattled guests like an incantation, meant to keep panic at bay. "Miss Marple." "If anyone can make sense of this madness," murmured Colonel Arkwright, "it's that quiet woman from St. Mary Mead." By the time Miss Marple arrived the next morning, the snow had layered over the garden paths, covering any footsteps. The estate was sealed. No one had left. The guests, now suspects, were confined to their rooms or the drawing halls, sipping tea or pacing nervously, their formal attire now wrinkled with worry. Inside the study the body had been removed, but the scene remained untouched. Miss Marple stood quietly near the fireplace, her gaze not on the bloodless rug or the locked window, but on the wax figurine, now cooled and lopsided, its shape barely distinguishable. She tilted her head and studied it not with suspicion, but curiosity, as if it were a misplaced button on a cardigan. She asked to see Sir Lionel's possessions from the night, the gloves, the cufflinks, even the dance card. Everything seemed ordinary. Then she asked to speak with Lady Devlin, the last person to see him alive. Lady Devlin was pale and tired, her eyes swollen from weeping. "We danced," she said, "and then he excused himself. I thought he was going for a cigar, but he never smoked cigars," said Miss Marple, gently turning a page in the dance card. The name Lady Devlin was listed for the final dance, but curiously, Sir Lionel's own handwriting was next to it, as though he had penciled her in himself, though the original entry had been someone else's. She didn't press the point. Not yet. Back in the study, Miss Marple requested the wax figure be brought to her. As the constable placed it into her hand, she turned it slowly. Embedded deep in the base, she found something curious, a small metal sliver, barely visible, but enough to catch a fingernail. She asked for a candle to be lit, then held the wax close. As it softened slightly again, she peeled back the surface. Inside, perfectly embedded in the center, was a microblade, thin as a feather, sharp as a surgeon's knife. "A clever way to smuggle a murder weapon," she murmured. "No fingerprints. Disposable, and so very quiet." "But how was it used?" asked the constable, leaning in. He was alone in the study. The room was locked. "Exactly," said Miss Marple, "which means he must have brought the weapon with him, not realizing it would kill him." The idea seemed ludicrous, but then she asked a peculiar question. "Was there any gift exchange last night?" Lady Haverton confirmed it. Small tokens passed between guests, a tradition of the winter ball. One of them had been a joke, a wax voodoo doll, some said, handed to Sir Lionel as a prank. The guest who gifted it claimed it was a harmless joke, hollow and silly, perhaps with a coin inside. Miss Marple smiled politely. Except it wasn't hollow, and it wasn't a joke. She turned to Lord Haverton. "Was Sir Lionel under any pressure lately? Legal? Financial?" Haverton frowned. "Only the matter of the inheritance. His brother's son, Crispin, was to be disinherited. Sir Lionel changed his will last week. That much I know." "And where is Crispin now?" she asked. "In the drawing room," came the reply, refusing to speak. "Then he's likely innocent," said Miss Marple softly. "People who refuse to speak rarely plan far enough ahead to keep quiet this long." Still, the question remained. Who gave him the wax figure? No one could remember clearly. The ball had been crowded, the drinks flowing, the lights warm and dim. Several guests claimed to have seen Sir Lionel holding the wax figure, but couldn't agree when he received it. Some said during the second dance, others during dinner. It was enough confusion to allow the real culprit to vanish in plain sight. Miss Marple made a final request, to speak with the orchestra conductor. "Were there any interruptions during the last waltz?" she asked. The man hesitated. "Well, yes, a string snapped. We had to pause for a moment. Just seconds." "And during that pause, was Sir Lionel still dancing?" "No," said the man slowly. "He had stepped away just for a moment." Miss Marple turned back to the constable. "Then that's our window." During the pause, he was lured or guided into the study. Told someone had left something for him, perhaps. And by picking up the wax figure, possibly heated by the fire, the embedded blade nicked his artery, quietly, cleanly. He never realized he'd been fatally cut. He sat down, thinking nothing of it, and then he bled inwardly, swiftly, silently. The constable stared at her. "So who planted it?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to the wax, now crumbled into her palm. "Someone who understood precision, a surgeon perhaps, or someone who studied under one." Her eyes flicked upward toward the stair landing, where Dr. Mirren, a guest and retired army physician, stood listening too closely. She said nothing more. Not yet. But the game had begun. Miss Marple did not immediately confront Dr. Mirren. Instead, she allowed the weight of silence to press upon the gathering. She stepped away from the study and requested access to the guest list and seating arrangements from the ball. Lord Haverton obliged with a heavy sigh, leading her to the morning room, where the papers were still scattered from last night's preparations. She took a seat without invitation, delicately flipping through the notes, menus, and place cards. Her expression was calm, even cheerful, but her fingers moved with certainty. There was something she had seen or sensed that she was now quietly chasing. Among the items listed was a seating chart with names neatly penned in ink, except one, which had been scratched out and replaced. That alone might seem harmless, but the ink on the replacement name was still slightly smudged, as though added at the last minute, the name in question, Dr. Edmund Mirren. Originally, that seat had been assigned to a Mrs. Bancroft who'd cancelled just hours before the ball due to a sudden illness. Miss Marple tucked the card into her handbag without comment. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The garden was now useless to the constables, who paced about the perimeter of the estate, looking for anything resembling a footprint or clue. Inside, the atmosphere had grown tense. The guests, once adorned, in glitter and silk, now wore heavy coats and worry. Miss Marple re-entered the study briefly and asked the constable to remove the andiron from the fireplace. It was cast iron, unremarkable, but slightly dislodged. As it was pulled out, a flicker of something white caught her eye. A torn corner of paper caught between the hearthstone and floorboard. With a gloved hand, she retrieved the sliver and examined it closely. It was the corner of a calling card. No name remained, but a faint trace of perfume clung to it. Lavender and bergamot. Unusual, certainly not the scent worn by Lady Devlin, who preferred rosewater. She requested a quiet word with the maid-staff and inquired which guests had stayed. In the blue guest room known for its perfumed linens, one name came up, Miss Eliza Rourke. Miss Rourke was a distant cousin of the Havertons, invited more out of obligation than closeness. A quiet woman, perhaps too quiet, with a habit of listening more than speaking. Miss Marple observed her from across the drawing-room. While others feigned small talk, Miss Rourke's eyes scanned the room in slow, deliberate arcs, not searching for comfort, searching for something else. Or someone. Rather than approach her directly, Miss Marple wandered to the piano, playing a soft note, before asking if anyone could perform. It was an old trick of hers. Observing people, when their attention shifted elsewhere, often revealed far more than a formal interrogation. As Lady Devlin volunteered a song and the guests turned their eyes to the piano, Miss Marple stayed still, watching the periphery. Miss Rourke's hand moved, subtle but telling, adjusting something at her wrist, beneath her sleeve. A nervous tick, or the hiding of something? Beside her, Dr. Mirren sat stiffly, no longer engaging in conversation with anyone. His hand rested too precisely on the armrest, covering something tucked beneath it. As the melody continued, Miss Marple excused herself and headed upstairs. In Sir Lionel's guest suite, she inspected his belongings. The drawer of his desk was locked, but not tightly. She eased it open with a thin pin from her shawl. Inside were letters. One was addressed to Lord Haverton, dated 3 days prior. It stated in short that Sir Lionel intended to expose a betrayal within these walls, and had arranged a private meeting after the ball. The note was vague, but clearly foreboding. Beneath it was a piece of paper with an odd sketch, what looked like a crude wax figure, marked with small symbols at each joint. It seemed foolish at first glance, but the longer she stared, the clearer it became. It was not symbolic at all, but anatomical. The drawing showed incision points. When Miss Marple returned downstairs, she found the inspector from Scotland Yard gathering statements. He was methodical, professional, but unaware that half the room had grown tight with calculated lies. He asked about guests' whereabouts, who saw whom and when. Most answers were vague. The ball had been crowded, faces blurred with movement, but Miss Marple requested to ask one question of her own. If any of you remember seeing Sir Lionel with the wax figure earlier in the evening, please raise your hand. Only 2 hands went up, Lady Haverton's, and surprisingly Mr. Griggs, a portly gentleman known for his wine import business. He hesitated, then admitted he'd seen it during dinner. He was toying with it like a child. It was passed to him as a gag gift, I think. But from whom? Griggs shook his head. I didn't catch. Perhaps someone will remember later, she said softly. Memory has a funny way of improving under pressure. That afternoon the house was quieter. Guests lingered, unsure whether to stay or go. Miss Marple asked Lord Haverton for access to the ball's gifts. Many had been placed on a side table and forgotten. She sifted through them with care. Among the trinkets was a black ribboned box with no tag. Inside it, a second wax figure, this one whole and untouched, still faintly warm despite the room's cold. It had no markings, but something was off. She took it back to the study and requested the constable heat a knife and cut it open. Inside was nothing. Miss Marple stood very still. The first was rigged. This one was a decoy. Someone made more than one, some as distractions, one as a weapon. She now knew what she needed, not just who had the motive, but who had the skill and access to craft something so precise. Dr. Mirren's medical knowledge was one answer, but Miss Rourke's quiet presence, her interest in psychology, and her peculiar time spent in the university's laboratory during her youth whispered another. There was still no proof, but the lies were beginning to thin. As evening descended, Miss Marple requested a final detail, access to the servant's logbook. She had a theory now, and if correct, it would all come down to timing. One entry, written just before midnight, confirmed it. The wax box had been moved from the drawing-room to Sir Lionel's seat by a footman, on the request of a lady in a dark blue dress. Miss Rourke had worn dark blue, but the footman had assumed it was Lady Devlin. The switch had been made. Miss Marple now saw the shape of the deception, but not yet the motive. That remained hidden, like a knife beneath wax. With the wax figure dissected and the footman's logbook offering its accidental clue, Miss Marple found the fabric of the story beginning to fray at the edges. But loose threads alone were not enough to pull apart a lie. She needed to listen to the tones of voices, the spaces between words, the tremble of half-truths disguised as civility. So she asked Lord Haverton to gather the guests in the drawing-room one by one, under the pretext of offering statements to aid the investigation. She would sit nearby, appearing disinterested, knitting quietly, while the inspector led the questioning. But it wasn't the questions she cared for. It was the answers people didn't know they were giving. Lady Devlin entered first, her demeanour delicate but strangely rehearsed. She reiterated her claim. She danced with Sir Lionel. He excused himself. She returned to her seat alone. Her voice never faltered, but her eyes flicked once, just once, toward the fireplace, as if checking that something remained hidden. When asked about the wax figure, she brushed it off as a silly novelty, then paused, as if unsure whether to say more. He laughed when he saw it, she added, said it reminded him of something, but he didn't explain. Her smile was too practiced, not dishonest, but careful, too careful. Next came Dr. Mirren. His voice was controlled, but there was a restraint to it, as if each word passed through a filter before leaving his mouth. He admitted he'd spoken with Sir Lionel briefly during the evening, discussing his brother's estate and the inheritance matter. He seemed preoccupied, agitated, Mirren said, eyes steady, but that was not unusual for him. When, Asked if he had ever seen the wax figure before, Mirren replied no, and this time Miss Marple caught the slightest tightening at the edge of his jaw. Not enough to accuse, but enough to note. Mr. Griggs followed, jovial and red-faced, eager to cooperate. He repeated his earlier observation about Sir Lionel toying with the wax, even adding that he thought it was part of some joke about voodoo, dolls. Someone said he was cursed. Wasn't serious, of course, he chuckled before leaning closer. Between you and me, Lionel made a number of enemies in business. I'm surprised something like this didn't happen sooner. That final comment hung in the air longer than he seemed to expect. He tried to mask it with a sip of sherry. Miss Marple's needles paused only a moment before resuming their quiet rhythm. Miss Eliza Rourke entered next, her expression composed, her tone soft. When asked about her whereabouts during the final waltz, she claimed she had stepped away from the ballroom for a moment, overwhelmed by the crowd. "Just a breath of air," she explained. "I felt faint." The inspector pressed. Her, where had she gone? "To the powder room," she said. "Then I returned and watched from the corner." But when asked whether she had spoken to Sir Lionel during the night, she hesitated. "Only in passing," she said at last. "A polite greeting, nothing more." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting for the first time and asked, almost too casually, "And the wax figure, did you see it?" Miss Rourke blinked. "No," she answered quickly. Too quickly. Lady Haverton followed, appearing exhausted. Her responses were brief, mechanical. "We were hosting. There were so many guests. I didn't keep track of every movement." She said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. But then, unprompted, she added, "It was a lovely party until that moment. The last waltz, I remember, was Sir Lionel's favourite." No one had mentioned that before. Miss Marple wondered whether that detail had emotional meaning, or whether it was a subtle attempt to redirect suspicion. Colonel Arkwright was next. Blunt, no nonsense, and bristling at the idea that a party among the elite could be reduced to police business. He admitted to having disliked Sir Lionel, a man of ego and entitlement, but claimed he was on the terrace at the time of the incident. "With Mrs. Lennox," he added. She later contradicted that, stating she had been in the library. When pressed, she tried to smooth over the gap, saying, "Perhaps he joined me later." But the damage was done. Contradictions like these did. Not scream guilt. They whispered confusion, motive, secrets. Miss Marple knew that true deception rarely came from the loudest voices. It crept in quietly, disguised in kindness, buried in misremembered timelines. She began to group people in her mind, those too eager, those too careful, and those who seemed to vanish in the background, hoping to be overlooked. She asked for the footman next, the one who had moved the box. His story was simple. "A lady asked me to place it on Sir Lionel's chair before dinner, said it was a joke between friends." When asked to describe her, he paused. "She wore a dark dress, maybe navy, tall, dark hair." Lady Devlin and Miss Rourke both fit that description. But his eyes drifted to Miss Rourke's seat before quickly looking away. That, too, was noted. In private, Miss Marple asked to speak again with Dr. Mirren, this time without the inspector. "You mentioned Sir Lionel seemed agitated," she said. "But I've heard from others he was quite jovial during the ball." Mirren shifted. He was putting on a face. I've known him for years. He was angry about the inheritance, angry about betrayal. He said someone close had lied to him. And did he name this person? No. Did he mention Miss Rourke? Only that she had reappeared unexpectedly. There it was. A sliver of truth, thin and sharp as the blade in the wax. Something had been unresolved between Sir Lionel and Eliza Rourke. She had not been invited originally. Her name had been added at the last moment. She had kept to herself all night, and now her story wobbled under scrutiny. But there were still gaps, still pieces missing. Miss Marple returned to the ballroom alone and stood near the edge of the floor, gazing out. Across the polished wood, she recalled a comment from Mr. Griggs about a joke, a curse. She remembered Sir Lionel's odd comment about the wax reminding him of something. And she recalled the drawing, those surgical lines on the limbs. She turned to the pianist, who had returned to collect sheet music. Did Sir Lionel say anything before he left the dance? The man scratched his head. Yes, something odd. He asked whether the music for the final waltz was the same as last year's. I told him it was. Then he said, "Fitting, isn't it?" I didn't know what he meant. Neither did she, yet. But that comment, that peculiar phrasing, was no accident. She had the sense Sir Lionel had recognized something, a pattern, a repeat, perhaps even a betrayal already seen once before. As she left the ballroom, she passed Miss Rourke on the stairs. Their eyes met only for a second, but in that second, something unspoken passed between them. The mask was slipping, and Miss Marple intended to be watching when it finally fell. Miss Marple remained near the stairs after her silent exchange with Miss Rourke, her gaze drifting toward the frost-laced windows while her thoughts travelled back through every fractured timeline she'd heard over the last day. The contradictions no longer stood alone. They were beginning to curve inward, drawing toward a centre. And at that centre she sensed not just a killer, but a carefully layered deception wrapped in motives that overlapped and conflicted like threads too tightly woven to pull apart with a single tug. She began her quiet work in the morning room, requesting paper, ink, and access to the house's previous event records. It seemed excessive to some, but Lord Haverton, recognizing the determined expression on her face, made no objection. She compiled a list. Every guest who had direct interactions with Sir Lionel, every person who had been near the wax figure, and everyone whose alibi had cracked even slightly under scrutiny. It was not a short list. Miss Rourke stood at the top, her sudden appearance, vague answers, and resemblance to someone Sir Lionel once mentioned in passing, suggesting she had not come simply for a party. Then there was Dr. Mirren, his steady manner concealing not just knowledge, but perhaps involvement deeper than he dared admit. Mr. Griggs had muttered too easily about Lionel's enemies, and Colonel Arkwright, blunt but evasive, had fabricated an alibi without clear reason. Yet none of them alone fit the crime in its entirety. Miss Marple asked Lady Haverton for a word. They sat near the fireplace, the flames throwing soft light across the rug, where Sir Lionel had once collapsed silently. "You've known Sir Lionel for decades," Miss Marple said gently. "Did he have any unresolved quarrels? Anyone he'd slighted or betrayed in the past?" Lady Haverton hesitated. "He was not a gentleman, ambitious, at times cruel. His brother's family never forgave him for contesting the will. And Eliza, she hasn't been here in years. They had a falling out once over something private. He called her a manipulator. I don't know the details." "Did she love him, lady?" Haverton's eyes narrowed slightly. "At one point, perhaps, but I believe that died long ago." Miss Marple nodded slowly, considering not just grief or betrayal, but humiliation, a motive wrapped in wounded pride. She thanked her and returned to the study, asking again for the calling card fragment they had found by the hearth. With it came another request, for access to Sir Lionel's private correspondence. A lockbox in his room revealed nothing shocking, until a torn envelope slipped behind a drawer revealed a letter written in longhand. It was unsigned, but the ink matched the handwriting on Sir Lionel's dance card. It read, "I know what you did. We will not stay silent forever. You took more than money. You took a future. It wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. Someone had come to collect." Miss Marple gathered all suspects in the drawing room under the guise of a group inquiry. The inspector allowed it, curious now about her unorthodox but effective style. She began not with questions, but a simple statement. The murder of Sir Lionel was no spontaneous act. It was planned with care, possibly for months. And yet it's tangled, not because there's a lack of suspects, but because everyone here had a reason to hate him. The room stiffened. She turned first to Mr. Griggs. "You lost nearly half your business holdings 3 years ago. Sir Lionel was the buyer, wasn't he?" Griggs flushed. "It was just business?" "Perhaps, but not kindness." To Colonel Arkwright. "Your regiment's funding was quietly withdrawn by a group that included Sir Lionel. You left in disgrace. A man like that doesn't forget." Arkwright's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Then to Dr. Mirren. "You treated Lionel's brother before his death. You were present when his last will was amended. That document was lost shortly after Lionel visited your clinic." Mirren shifted. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm only observing," Miss Marple said softly. Finally, her eyes met Miss Rourke's. "You disappeared for 10 years, then returned quietly, changed your name, and re-entered his circle as if nothing had passed. He once called you a manipulator. Did he know who you truly were? I never lied about my name. No, but you avoided the truth. You are not just Eliza Rourke. You were his ward, practically raised in his household, and you were meant to marry his nephew." A sharp breath escaped Lady Devlin. Even she hadn't known. "Eliza," Miss Marple continued, "lost everything when Sir Lionel cut off support to her family, after accusing them of stealing from him. But he had no proof, only his pride." Eliza's voice finally broke through the silence. "He destroyed us, lied to his solicitor, shamed my father in public. We couldn't recover. My brother took his life 6 months later. Lionel left us, in the dirt while he built an empire." There was no hysteria in her tone, only ice. "I didn't kill him," she said. Miss Marple looked at her with deep calm. "I believe you didn't act alone." Eyes turned toward Dr. Mirren. "We spoke once," Eliza said quietly. "Years ago, after my brother's funeral. He told me something Lionel said in confidence, that he regretted nothing, that some people deserved ruin." "And the wax?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eliza hesitated. "I knew it would get his attention. He'd seen something like it once in Africa, a tribal symbol. He was afraid of curses. It was a bluff, a scare. But someone else turned your bluff into a weapon." All eyes returned to Dr. Mirren, whose silence now pressed against the room like a held breath. "He was dying," Mirren said at last. "Did you know that? He had months. He confided in me 2 weeks ago, told me to keep it quiet. No one could know. He wanted his legacy clean." "Why did you kill him?" Miss Marple asked. "I didn't," Mirren said evenly, but I knew what the wax figure meant. I recognized Eliza's game. I didn't stop it. Silence followed. He believed he was cursed, Mirren continued. He died of panic, not poison. A heart already weak, pushed over the edge. Miss Marple folded her hands. He died of blood loss. The blade hidden in the wax was real. Mirren looked at her then, truly startled. I didn't. But someone did. Now, a second silence fell, heavier, colder. Miss Marple turned not to Mirren or Eliza, but to Lady Devlin. You were the last to dance with him. You told us he laughed at the figure, but you weren't supposed to be his partner for the final waltz. That slot was changed at the last minute. Lady Devlin's face remained calm, but something drained from her eyes. He never danced with anyone he didn't trust, Miss Marple said. But you knew where the wax would be. You'd seen him touch it earlier. When you embraced him during the waltz, you slipped it into his coat. Heated by his own body, the blade cut through slowly. By the time he reached the study, he was already bleeding internally. Lady Devlin didn't deny it. She simply exhaled, long, steady. I didn't mean for it to kill him, she said, only to make him suffer. He humiliated me, ruined my son's future, my family's name. Eliza's voice came like a whisper. You turned a bluff into blood. Miss Marple stood. No one here is innocent, she said. Only unequal in guilt. The inspector stepped forward then, but no one moved. The web had been untangled, but the strand still hung heavy in the air, glistening with the weight of what vengeance costs, even when justified. As the confession left Lady Devlin's lips, the inspector moved swiftly, as if the very act of speaking guilt into existence justified immediate closure. He signalled for 2 constables to escort her from the drawing-room, her expression unchanging, as she rose with a grace that defied the circumstances. She did not protest, nor weep, nor apologize. She only looked at Eliza for a fleeting second, something cold and unreadable passing between them, before turning and vanishing behind the heavy doors. The room deflated. Guests began to exhale, tension released in whispers and movement. Lord Haverton murmured something about informing the staff, while Colonel Arkwright sank into a chair, muttering that he always suspected Devlin had too much pride for her own good. Miss Rourke remained still, and Dr. Mirren leaned against the wall with folded arms, watching Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. The inspector returned minutes later, with a satisfied air. We've found the piece that connects it all, he announced. Lady Devlin's gloves, discovered in the ballroom cloakroom, have a small trace of wax near the right thumb. It matches the remains on Sir Lionel's coat. He turned to Miss Marple, as if expecting her to nod and congratulate him. You were correct. She delivered the fatal item during the dance. The case, I dare say, is closed. Miss Marple smiled, gently, her knitting needles once again in motion. It would be convenient, wouldn't it? She said lightly. The inspector paused. You disagree? I believe Lady Devlin played a role, but I also believe her intent was misjudged. She admitted to causing him harm. She admitted to slipping the wax into his coat. She did not confess to knowing the blade was inside. But the gloves would have been enough to move the wax, yes, she said calmly. But what concerns me is this. If Lady Devlin truly intended to murder Sir Lionel, why use something so elaborate? Why a blade within wax, dependent on body heat and timing? Why not something far simpler? The inspector's shoulders tightened. People don't always think rationally when planning revenge. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said. But this crime required surgical knowledge. Precision. The wax had to be crafted in advance. A specific temperature, a precise depth. It was not created by someone fueled by last-minute rage. She stood and walked slowly to the window, the snowy gardens now layered in a deeper white, the sky darkening. "Do you recall the original seating plan?" she asked, not turning. The inspector blinked. Vaguely. "Lady Devlin was not supposed to sit beside Sir Lionel during dinner," she said. "That change was made late. In fact, several placements were altered. I've checked the handwritten notes, and I've also confirmed the wax box was delivered to the ballroom well before anyone knew she would be in such close proximity." She turned at last. "Someone prepared this in advance and allowed Lady Devlin to act as a carrier, unwittingly, perhaps deliberately. But they planned around her, not with her." The inspector frowned. "So you believe she was used?" "Quite possibly. And her confession, while emotionally true, may have been built on guilt rather than fact." There was a silence. A few guests had lingered, listening quietly from the adjoining hall. Miss Marple looked now at Dr. Mirren, whose eyes met hers steadily. "The gloves," she said softly, "may have the wax on them. But that tells us only that she handled it. It does not prove she made it. It does not prove she knew." The inspector hesitated, then opened his notebook again. "Then you're suggesting someone else built the weapon?" "Yes. Someone who knew Sir Lionel's medical history. Someone who understood how to make a wound seem harmless at first, clean, bloodless, fatal only minutes later." Mirren's voice was quiet. "You're accusing me again." "I'm asking you," Miss Marple said. "How long the wax figure could remain intact at body temperature?" Mirren replied too quickly. 30 minutes, give or take. But it melted in far less time in Sir Lionel's coat. A pause. Then more slowly, "Perhaps the environment was warmer than we realized." She stepped forward. And when the inspector checked the study's fireplace, the andiron had been disturbed. The fire had been stoked recently, despite the room being unused for hours. Someone ensured it was warm enough, not for comfort, but for timing. Dr. Mirren looked at her for a long moment. "Your case won't hold," he said softly. "I agree," she replied. "That's the trouble with truth that arrived too soon. They don't hold because the real story is still unfolding." The inspector interrupted, then clearing his throat. "Until further evidence appears, I have no cause to hold anyone else. Lady Devlin's confession and the physical trace are sufficient to detain her. If more comes to light, we'll reopen it." Miss Marple offered a courteous nod, but her eyes remained fixed on Mirren. The guests began to leave the drawing room, moving in waves of relieved conversation. The inspector returned to his paperwork, but Miss Marple remained seated, knitting untouched on her lap, mind working beneath the calm exterior. She did not feel the relief the others wore, like coats suddenly unbuttoned. She felt something else, entirely. A disquiet, a wrongness. Later that evening, as most of the house retreated into tired silence, she returned to the study one last time. The fire had gone cold. The room smelled faintly of smoke and aged wood. She examined the floor beneath the chair where Lionel had died. Her fingers traced the carpet's edge and found something almost invisible, a tiny glint pressed between the fibers. She picked it up with care, a single sliver of glass, not wax, not metal, glass. She turned it in her fingers, eyes narrowing. The murder weapon had a second element. The blade inside the wax was not alone. It had been reinforced, perhaps even guided by a structure now shattered and hidden. She had been wrong about one thing. The murder was not merely precise.
It was scientific, tested, and someone, somewhere in this house, had treated it like an experiment. A confession may have satisfied the law. But Miss Marple was not yet satisfied. Miss Marple held the glass sliver up to the light until it caught the faintest shimmer. It wasn't part of a drinking vessel or mirror. This was shaped, deliberate, a fragment of something once whole and specific. Carefully wrapping it in her handkerchief, she tucked it away in her bag, the weight of it far heavier than its size suggested. As she turned back to the empty chair, the hush of the study surrounded her like breath held too long. Something had cracked, not just in the present investigation, but in the story Sir Lionel had tried to keep buried long before this ball was ever planned. That night, long after the guests had gone to their rooms, Miss Marple requested the Haverton family archive. It was kept in a locked cabinet in the library, a collection of estate documents, ledgers, legal correspondence, and handwritten letters going back decades. She had no clear idea of what she was searching for, only a pull, a sense that the crime they had all been staring at was merely the final act of something older. Among the dust-covered folders, she found Sir Lionel's correspondence with a name she hadn't expected to see again: Dr. Edmund Mirren. The letters were dated nearly 15 years prior, long before Sir Lionel's rise to social prominence. There was nothing incriminating at first glance: formal exchanges about estate health programs and a private clinic investment. But one letter stood out. It was handwritten, more personal, the words tense beneath their polite surface. "You assured me the subject would not survive the trial, that the results would be clean and containable. Now I find the opposite, and worse, her brother is asking questions. You were paid to erase, not to experiment." Miss Marple stared at the paper, its edges worn, the signature unmistakable. Sir Lionel's own hand. She read it again. Subject: trial. Erase. Her thoughts returned immediately to Eliza Rourke. She waited until morning to approach her. The younger woman was seated in the solarium, alone, arms crossed tight across her chest, despite the sunlit warmth. When Miss Marple sat beside her, she didn't speak. She simply waited. After a long pause, Eliza looked up, her voice brittle. "You know, don't you? I know you were never meant to be part of the inheritance. You were meant to disappear, quietly. But you came back." Eliza didn't look surprised. "He called it a medical trial, said it would cure my mother's condition. We were desperate, Miss Marple. She was declining so fast. No money, no help. Then he introduced us to Dr. Mirren." Miss Marple listened, saying nothing. It wasn't a cure. It was untested. She screamed every night. Her condition worsened within weeks. And when she died, Lionel claimed she'd have died anyway. Mirren wrote the report. It made everything seem legal. "And your brother? He stole copies of the original test records. Letters between Lionel and Mirren. They threatened to sue. Lionel made him a deal, money to vanish. But it broke him. He didn't want to vanish. He wanted justice. So you came back to finish what he couldn't." "I came back to watch Lionel fall," Eliza said. "To make him see what he destroyed. But I didn't kill him. I never meant to touch the wax again. I only wanted him to believe the curse was real, to make him sweat." Miss Marple believed her. There was no satisfaction in Eliza's voice. No victory. only the dull weight of grief worn for too long. Later, she found Dr. Mirren walking through the garden paths, his coat collar turned up against the cold. She joined him without invitation. He said nothing, but she spoke softly. She was never meant to survive that trial, was she? His stride slowed. You read the letters. She was the subject. Her death was supposed to leave no loose ends. But there were two, her daughter and her son. Dr. Mirren exhaled heavily, clouds of breath curling around them. I told Lionel not to go forward. I warned him it wasn't ready. He refused. He wanted results he could market, proof that his money bought miracles. When the woman died, he buried it, paid me handsomely to do the same. Miss Marple tilted her head, and yet, when Eliza returned, you didn't stop her. I thought she only wanted answers. Closure. I didn't know she'd planned the wax. But you recognized it. He nodded once. From Africa. A method used by certain tribes. Dolls with embedded bone needles. Not fatal, just enough to scare. I thought it was a bluff. But someone else turned that bluff into a murder, she said. And that someone wasn't Eliza. Dr. Mirren stopped walking. What are you suggesting? That this murder wasn't about revenge or justice? Not entirely. It was also about silence. Eliza's presence threatened to reopen the past. Someone still invested in keeping that past buried acted first. Mirren's silence was answer enough. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the study once again. She stood by the fire and pulled the sliver of glass from her handbag. Then she searched the bookshelves, not for books, but for gaps. In the third row from the top, behind a row of old accounting ledgers, her fingers brushed an uneven edge. She pulled gently. A hidden drawer clicked loose, revealing a small glass vial, cracked. The shape matched the fragment she had found on the floor. And within the velvet lining of the hidden drawer, she found a folded letter addressed to Lord Haverton. Inside it, in Sir Lionel's hurried scrawl, were the words, "If anything happens to me, look to Mirren, look to the trial, and above all, look to the funds buried in the St. Helena account. They all have reason to keep me quiet. Now." Miss Marple stood very still. The wax was not the only method planned. Sir Lionel had known he was hunted, and it was not Eliza he feared. It was the ones who'd profited with him, the ones who couldn't afford his confessions to surface. She turned slowly toward the door, the shadows of the fire dancing across her figure. The murder was
not born of rage. It was self-preservation, calculated, and it was not over. Miss Marple stood motionless before the fire, her fingers grazing the edge of the hidden drawer as the full weight of Sir Lionel's last warning settled over her. This wasn't merely a case of an angry guest seeking vengeance. It was a system of secrets, built on mutual corruption, now splintering under the weight of exposure. Someone still within these walls had moved quietly, decisively, to end the threat Lionel posed to all of them. And they were watching, waiting, to see if their efforts had succeeded. She left the study without a word and made her way to the drawing room, where the guests had gathered again, subdued and uncertain after the previous day's confession. Lady Devlin remained in custody, but her absence had created an unexpected calm. The illusion of resolution hung over the house like low fog, thin enough to see through, but thick enough to make people hesitate. Miss Marple took her seat near the fireplace and quietly asked the footman to bring a tray of tea. She poured for everyone herself, careful to keep the atmosphere polite, almost casual. Conversations flickered between the remaining guests, Dr. Mirren, Eliza Rourke, Mr. Griggs, Colonel Arkwright, and a few others who had drifted into peripheral suspicion but never quite made the leap to the center of the storm. She watched them carefully. No one met her gaze directly. After the cups had been handed out, she smiled pleasantly and addressed the room. "I wonder," she said in her quiet voice, "whether any of you believe in fate." There was a pause, then a few polite shrugs, murmured, half-responses. Colonel Arkwright chuckled. "If fate had any hand in this, it's a clumsy one." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's very precise. You see, I was reminded this morning of an experiment I once read about. A study conducted at Cambridge on how the smallest shift in behavior, under stress, can reveal far more than words. They called it a delayed conscience response. Rather a cold name, but quite accurate. Dr. Mirren tilted his head. "You're referring to psychological profiling?" "In a way," she said. They would stage a conversation, much like this one, and slip in a question that had no context, no relevance. A question designed to provoke the subconscious rather than the rational mind. And they watched who hesitated. Mr. Griggs laughed, nervously. "Sounds like mind games to me." "Oh no," Miss Marple replied lightly. "It's not the mind that gives us away. It's the hands." She set her cup down. "For instance, when I asked the inspector earlier whether anyone had seen a letter from Sir Lionel, two people immediately glanced at their shoes. Not each other, not the inspector, their shoes." Dr. Mirren spoke slowly. "And what does that suggest?" "Nothing," she said. "Unless you know the contents of the letter." Eliza shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing. Miss Marple continued. "Now I'd like to try a little something. No questions, no accusations, just a small observation." She opened her knitting bag and pulled out a folded piece of linen. Inside, wrapped carefully, was the glass fragment. She placed it on the table before them. "Earlier," she said, "I found this lodged in the study carpet near where Sir Lionel died. I believe it's from a vial, likely medicinal. Shattered either during the act or afterward. I was curious whether anyone here recognizes it." The room went very still. Eyes dropped to the glass. Dr. Mirren didn't move. Mr. Griggs leaned, in slightly squinting at it with vague interest. Colonel Arkwright crossed his arms, but one person flinched, not noticeably, not enough to seem suspicious. Just the slightest tightening of the fingers around a teacup. "Eliza." Miss Marple caught it. "Curious, isn't it?" she said. "That something so small could change everything. Of course, it's also possible the glass was a red herring. But it made me think of Sir Lionel's medical file, his real one, not the version we were all shown." She reached into her bag again and retrieved a second item. This time, a folded sheet bearing Sir Lionel's name. "I had the inspector call his physician late last night. It seems Lionel wasn't dying, as Dr. Mirren suggested. In fact, his last checkup showed his heart was stable, his vitals healthy." Dr. Mirren didn't speak. "But here's the curious part," she added. "He'd requested a renewal for a rare anticoagulant, something typically reserved for high-risk patients, but he wasn't one." She unfolded the page. "And this particular medication is only carried by a handful of specialists in this country." She let the silence stretch just long enough. "Dr. Mirren," she said softly, "do you carry this medication?" His jaw clenched, but he remained composed. "I do. I use it for patients recovering from bypass operations." "And Sir Lionel was not such a patient." "I didn't prescribe it to him." Miss Marple nodded. "No. But he had it in his system, according to the coroner's preliminary report. The autopsy revealed minor bleeding consistent with a delayed coagulopathy, meaning the blade alone might not have killed him, but the presence of this drug ensured it did." Everyone was staring now. Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Eliza. "When I showed you the glass, you reacted, not with guilt, but recognition, because you saw that same vial once before, hidden among your mother's medications, the same drug that hastened her decline." Eliza didn't speak. Her eyes shimmered, but she held herself together. "It wasn't just a test trial," Miss Marple continued. "It was an experiment in controlling life expectancy. Sir Lionel wanted control over time, when someone lived, when someone died. You brought back the wax figure to unsettle him, but someone else made sure that when he died, it would be clean, precise, and untraceable." She turned slowly toward Dr. Mirren. "Did you think the wax would cover the rest? That it would take the blame entirely?" He finally responded, voice calm, but tired. "I didn't inject him with anything. He must have stolen it." Miss Marple gave a sad smile. "He didn't steal it. He trusted you, even after everything. He thought you'd keep him alive longer. That's why he kept you close." Mirren stood slowly, setting his teacup down without a sound. "If I confess, it will destroy my license," Miss Marple nodded. "And if you don't, it may destroy someone else's life entirely." The room remained frozen. The truth settled in every corner now. What had seemed like justice driven by the past was actually a calculated elimination, masquerading as retribution. One woman's grief had masked another man's ambition, and the clue that cracked it all wasn't blood or fingerprints, but a reaction to a shard of glass, and a heartbeat that skipped when no question had been asked. The stillness that followed. Dr. Mirren's quiet admission was broken only by the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting each second like a warning. The tension in the drawing room had shifted from confusion to something tighter, sharper, recognition of just how close they were to understanding the truth and how quickly it could slip away again. Dr. Mirren sat back down slowly, his composure cracking just enough to betray a flicker of fear behind his measured words. No further confession came, but the air around him felt changed, charged with unspoken guilt. Yet Miss Marple didn't press him further. Not yet. Instead, she handed the vial fragment and the hidden letter from the study drawer to the inspector, who had been listening silently from the doorway. He examined the items with care, visibly shaken by their implications. "We'll need to secure these," he said quietly. "They'll be crucial in building the full case." Miss Marple nodded, but a weight pressed on her chest. She had seen this before. The turning point, the moment when truth steps forward, and just as quickly, the darkness pulls back. Because evidence, once revealed, becomes a target. And someone, somewhere in the house, was watching just as carefully, calculating what needed to disappear to preserve their own safety. By late afternoon, the snow outside had deepened. The house staff moved slowly through their routines, the tension rippling just beneath the surface. The inspector, now fully convinced of Dr. Mirren's deeper involvement, left the evidence with his constable under strict instructions. The fragment, the letter, and the preliminary toxicology notes from the coroner were all sealed in a box and placed in the inspector's secured briefcase in the estate's study. He intended to take it back to London at first light. Miss Marple lingered nearby, her unease growing as the evening set in. The hallways had grown too quiet, and the usual comfort of the crackling fire now felt too deliberate, as if it masked footsteps not meant to be heard. She excused herself after dinner and walked the upper corridor with slow, deliberate steps, eyes drawn to the shadows at corners, the faint scent of smoke that didn't come from the hearth. Her instinct didn't come from paranoia. It came from pattern. Someone had made it this far by hiding in plain sight. They would not stop now. By morning, her fears proved correct. The inspector's briefcase, which had been locked and stored beneath the study desk, was gone. The lock had been tampered with, the drawer pried open, the entire case vanished as if it had never existed. The constable, red-faced and stammering, had no explanation. "I was outside the room all night," he said. "No one entered, I swear it." But someone had. The inspector raged quietly, his embarrassment thinly veiled beneath orders for a full search of the estate. Staff were questioned, guests confined again. But the damage was done. The letter was gone. The vial fragment too. Any direct link between Dr. Mirren and Sir Lionel's manipulated medication had evaporated into the same silence the killer had always worked within. Miss Marple didn't speak as chaos unfolded. She sat in the corner of the library, eyes narrowed, knitting untouched in her lap. She hadn't trusted the safety of the evidence, but she'd hoped the urgency of discovery might outpace the saboteur. It hadn't. Now they were racing not just against lies, but against the destruction of truth. She considered the facts again. Dr. Mirren had motive, knowledge, access. But he had also hesitated. His reaction to the vial had been real. Perhaps he hadn't known it had been used. Perhaps he hadn't acted alone. That, more than anything, gnawed at her now. At midday, she asked to speak with Lord Haverton privately. He met her in the breakfast room, wearing the drawn expression of a man whose control over his estate had long since slipped from his grasp. "I'm afraid I must ask something unusual," she said. "Sir Lionel had an offshore account listed. In his letter, St. Helena. Do you know anything about it?" Lord Haverton hesitated. "We have holdings there. Very old investments. Lionel managed them personally. He rarely discussed them." Would there be records in his study? Only access ledgers. The actual statements are kept in the vault. The estate vault, he nodded. Miss Marple stood. "Then I'd like to see it." Down a narrow hall behind a panelled door most had forgotten existed, Lord Haverton unlocked the family vault. It smelled of old paper and sealed air. Inside were rows of ledgers, deeds, bonds, neatly organised. She scanned the bindings quickly. One caught her eye. It was labelled Research Disbursements, Clinic Support. Inside, a list of payments, stretched across 10 years, many of them directed to accounts under the names of medical suppliers and private clinics, including one marked only as EM Consulting. "Edmund Mirren," she said aloud. Lord Haverton glanced over. "That name appears often in Lionel's older accounts. I assumed it was professional." "He was never professional about secrets," Miss Marple murmured. She flipped further and froze. A final entry, recent, dated 2 weeks before the winter ball. "Asset liquidation, EM account cleared. Prepare for closure." Miss Marple drew a sharp breath. Lionel hadn't just known he was in danger. He had begun to cut off his accomplices. Perhaps he'd intended to confess. Perhaps he'd hoped to blackmail them one last time. But he'd made one miscalculation. He assumed fear would keep them loyal. When they left the vault, Miss Marple asked quietly if the staff records for the past decade could be brought to her room. She reviewed them late into the night. She wasn't looking for names. She was looking for movements, connections. One name appeared, then vanished, then appeared again under a slightly altered title. Not a doctor, not a guest, not even on the suspect list, the house steward, Mr. Calloway. He'd worked for the estate for years, quiet, unremarkable, invisible in his efficiency. But 10 years ago, he'd worked as a lab assistant in a private facility connected to one of the same clinics listed in Lionel's records, and now he handled keys, rooms, locks. She waited until early dawn before requesting the inspector detain him quietly. They found him in the servants' wing, packing a bag. In it was the briefcase. The contents had been removed, but the casing was enough. When confronted, he didn't deny possession. He only said, "I was told to clean up loose ends." "By whom?" the inspector demanded. Calloway remained silent. Miss Marple looked at him, calm and certain. Was it Dr. Mirren? Still silence. Or was it someone else entirely? Someone we haven't seen yet? A flicker passed through his eyes then. Fear. And something else. Obedience. Miss Marple stepped back. The sabotage hadn't been to protect one man. It had been orchestrated to protect many, and somewhere among them the real architect still waited, watching to see who would be clever enough to find them before the next silence fell. The soft knock on Miss Marple's door came just before dawn. She had not yet changed from her nightdress, though she'd spent little of the night resting. Her mind had turned circles around the discovery of the steward's involvement, the vanishing briefcase, and the string of payments hiding in plain sight. She rose from her chair, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door. The housemaid stood there, trembling. "Miss, it's Miss Rourke. She's gone. Gone." Miss Marple followed the girl down the corridor, not running, but with urgency in every step. Eliza Rourke's room was at the far end of the east wing. The door hung open. Inside, the bed was made. A suitcase sat atop it, half open but not packed. Her coat still hung on the hook by the dresser. The window had been unlatched, yet snow from the ledge remained undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no trail of departure. She had not walked out the front door, nor climbed from the window. The inspector arrived minutes later, pulling on gloves, face grim with fatigue and growing alarm. "She couldn't have gotten far," he muttered, sending 2 constables to search the grounds. "No carriage, no vehicle. She has to be in the house." But Miss Marple wasn't looking at the window or the bed, her attention fixed on the single chair by the writing desk. A teacup sat on the edge, untouched. The porcelain rattled slightly when she lifted it. Still warm. Eliza hadn't left of her own accord. She'd been taken, and whoever had done it hadn't expected the absence to be discovered this soon. Downstairs, Lord Haverton stood in the main hall in his robe, confusion etched across his face. Another disappearance, but why? Miss Marple didn't answer. She headed directly to the drawing room where the guests had gathered once again, roused by whispers of Eliza's vanishing. Mr. Griggs looked pale. Colonel Arkwright rubbed his temples. Dr. Mirren stood alone by the fireplace, expression unreadable. "No one is to leave the house," the inspector declared. "Miss Rourke has vanished. We are treating this as an abduction or worse." The words hung heavily. Miss Marple stepped forward, voice steady. This was not spontaneous. Someone knew she had seen something, perhaps remembered something, and moved quickly to silence her. She was the last person left who could trace the truth back to the root, not just to Lionel's murder, but to what began long before. Mr. Griggs stepped forward, voice trembling. "This is madness. We're guests, not prisoners." "Guests don't erase evidence," Miss Marple said gently. "Guests don't hire stewards with criminal pasts to burn correspondence." Griggs flinched. "I didn't know—" "No, but someone did. Someone who used their position and wealth to place people in convenient roles. Someone who had the means to watch everything unfold without ever being touched." Her gaze swept the room. Lionel was going to expose the St. Helena accounts. They weren't just investment shells, they were funnels, channels used to finance off-the-record trials, paid silence, and patient disappearances. He realized too late that confessing would cost him more than reputation. It would endanger everyone who profited with him. Dr. Mirren folded his arms. "And you think Eliza found that proof?" "I think she saw her mother's name on one of the ledgers," Miss Marple replied. "Or perhaps remembered it. She was young when her mother died, but trauma preserves strange fragments. A clinic name, a date, a symbol. And once she asked for access to the vault, once she started digging, someone knew they had to stop her." The inspector turned toward the guests. "We'll be searching rooms, all of them, and we'll be checking the servants' quarters again." As the constables moved out, Miss Marple quietly took the inspector aside. "If Eliza's still alive," she said, "we need to find her before nightfall. Whoever took her needs time to threaten, to silence, or to move her somewhere permanent." "The Inspector nodded. "Where would you start?" Miss Marple thought for a long moment. "The West Cellars," she said at last. "No one's mentioned them. But they connect to the oldest parts of the house, service tunnels, locked for years, until someone decided they needed a place no one would think to look. They descended with 2 constables, past the servants, kitchens and down a corridor that narrowed with each step. The door to the West Cellars was old iron, rusted, and bore a heavy padlock. The constable pried it loose. Inside, the cold struck immediately. Damp, silent. Rows of crates lined the walls, wine bottles, coal bins. And in the far corner, barely visible, a small storeroom with a rope looped through the handle. Miss Marple reached it first. Inside, Eliza sat on the floor, wrists bound, mouth gagged but unharmed. Her eyes were wide, but the relief in them swelled instantly as the gag came loose. "He didn't want me to speak," she whispered hoarsely. "Who?" asked the inspector, crouched beside her. She opened her mouth, and the name came out flat. "Griggs." The inspector spun back up the stairs before the rest could process it. Back in the drawing room, Mr. Griggs had just slipped on his overcoat when the inspector entered. The constables followed behind with purpose. "I think you've overstayed." "You're welcome," the inspector said grimly. Griggs turned, surprised, not afraid. "You have no proof." "No," said Miss Marple, appearing behind the constables. "Your steward's silence says otherwise. So do the St. Helena records. So does Eliza's testimony." Griggs's face cracked then, just slightly. She wouldn't have known what to do with it, he said softly. She was digging into things that had been settled long ago. "Settled?" Miss Marple echoed. "You mean covered?" She was threatening to drag us into court. All of us. The deals Lionel made, the clients I arranged, the money Mirren funneled. It would have destroyed everything, my entire firm. I built it from nothing. You built it with blood money. He didn't deny it. "I didn't kill Lionel," he said. I only made sure the right figure ended up in the right coat pocket. Miss Marple nodded. You let Devlin place it. You let Lionel seal his own fate. And when Eliza returned, you thought you could frighten her into silence. I tried to offer her money. She came for justice, Mr. Griggs, not your hush fee. The inspector stepped forward. Griggs didn't resist. As the constables led him away, Miss Marple returned to Eliza's side. She placed a hand gently on the young woman's shoulder. It's over, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it wasn't. Not entirely. Justice would take its time catching up to the full truth. But the shadow that had hung over the winter ball had finally broken, and the house, cold, silent, steeped in secrets, could finally breathe. The morning that followed was quieter than the ones before it, but the hush was uneasy, stretched taut rather than at peace. The house felt hollow, like it had exhaled too much at once. Mr. Griggs had been taken into custody under close guard, but his confession was partial at best. He admitted to manipulating the wax figure's placement, to working with the steward, and to orchestrating Eliza's abduction, but he hadn't admitted to killing Lionel. He insisted, again and again, that the figure was intended to frighten, not to kill, that someone else had used it more cleverly than even he had planned. Miss Marple sat alone by the window in the drawing room, watching the snow taper off into a soft drizzle. For the first time, she let her knitting fall idle in her lap. Her mind sifted through the clutter, threads of motive, lies, half-truths. Griggs had built a system to keep secrets buried, but the murder itself, it was still too perfect. The wax, the anticoagulant, the timing, it had all functioned with surgical precision. Griggs had coordinated it, perhaps, but he lacked the finesse. And that meant the person responsible for the final step, the kill, was still present. Still quiet, still pretending. She glanced around the room. Dr. Mirren had remained at the estate under unofficial watch and sat by the fire with a book unopened in his hands. Lord Haverton was in his study, clearing the last of the estate ledgers. Eliza, though physically safe, had withdrawn, barely speaking since her release from the cellar. There was no sense of resolution, just a hollow victory. And then it came. The shift. A memory, faint, previously unimportant, nudged forward from the recesses of her mind. It was from the night of the ball, the orchestra's pause during the final waltz, the moment the string snapped. Sir Lionel had stepped away then, briefly, before returning to finish the dance with Lady Devlin. The timing had always puzzled her. Why would a man known for formality, for control, abandon his partner in the middle of a dance? She rose suddenly and walked to the music room. The grand piano stood against the far wall, untouched since the event. Sheet music was still strewn across the stand. She flipped through it, her fingers pausing on a handwritten note in the margin of the final waltz. It wasn't musical notation, just two initials, EM. She frowned. Not the conductor's handwriting, not any musician's. Then what was it doing here? She returned to the main corridor and asked the inspector for the musician's guest list. He fetched it without protest, still embarrassed by how close the killer had slipped past his gaze. The conductor's name, the violinist's, the harpist, and there, third cellist, Edward Morris. Do we still have any of the orchestra at the estate? She asked. The inspector frowned. They left the morning after the ball. Why? She traced her finger over the name. Because this is the third time I've seen that set of initials. once on the music sheet, once on the St. Helena ledger under a payment marked EM Supplies, and once in Lionel's last letter, he referred to someone by initials alone. You're saying it's not Mirren? I'm saying Mirren may not have acted alone, and I suspect he never thought he'd be the one suspected. They called the orchestra company. The conductor remembered Morris as quiet, precise, always early. He had been hired by special request for the winter ball, and that raised the question, who requested him? Miss Marple returned to the steward's logs. The staff had recorded deliveries, setups, room assignments, and tucked between the schedule, pages was a notation written in different handwriting. Ensure EM receives guest credentials, authorized by LH. But Lord Haverton had no recollection of such a request, and his signature didn't match. Miss Marple stood very still, realization blooming behind her eyes. EM hadn't stood for Edmund Mirren. It had stood for Edward Morris all along. She requested to see the storage room where the orchestra's gear had been kept. It was untouched since the ball. Sheet music, stands, cases. One cello case remained, unclaimed, heavier than the others. She opened it slowly. Inside was an empty vial, the same shape, the same glass as the fragment found on the study floor. Beneath it, folded and tucked into the lining, was a cloth stained with dried wax, and under that, notes, lists of deliveries, ingredient quantities, heating instructions, a formula for creating the wax figure. The inspector read it over her shoulder, face paling. This is your proof." Miss Marple nodded, but her focus had already shifted. She recalled something else now, barely, a whisper of detail. On the night of the ball, just before the final waltz, the conductor had paused, not just for the broken string, but because someone had slipped off stage. A man with a musician's badge, heading toward the study corridor. The killer had been hired for the evening, given a guest's credentials, smuggled in as entertainment. Used Griggs' plan, used Mirren's silence, used Devlin's anger, used Eliza's grief. The killer had turned every motive into camouflage and vanished the next day with the musicians, his cello case packed not with music but with murder. It was elegant, clinical, impossibly clean. But he had left behind one thing, a pattern of movement only visible once all others had stopped. She handed the evidence to the inspector. "Put out a warrant. Edward Morris, if that's his real name." "You believe he was paid?" "I believe he was precise, which means he wasn't improvising." The inspector hesitated. "Then who hired him?" Miss Marple looked toward the window where snow now turned to sleet. The question still hung in the air. "Griggs may have opened the door," she said. "But someone paid for the key." And now, finally, they had a trail, not just of wax and glass, but of names, dates, deposits. The pattern had formed in silence, but it had never stopped moving, and Miss Marple was ready to follow it. By evening, the storm had returned. Sleet drummed against the windows, masking the creaks and murmurs of the old house, while inside the atmosphere had shifted again. There was no longer the illusion of safety. With the discovery of the cello case and the planted initials, even the most skeptical among them began to understand that the killer had been within arm's reach the entire time, smiling politely behind the mask of hired performance. The inspector had sent a telegram to the London Metropolitan, requesting immediate location efforts for Edward Morris, or whatever name the man had used to slip into the orchestra. But Miss Marple remained at the estate, seated at the far end of the library, with the ledger still open before her, her fingers resting lightly on the corner of a page she'd turned over multiple times. The page that listed the payments. The one that didn't make sense. The number was wrong. Too high for a musician's fee, too low for a full bribe. It wasn't a contractor's price, it was a payout. And it was dated a full month before the winter ball was even announced. She traced the entry again, her mind moving quietly, relentlessly. This hadn't started with Lionel's public shift of conscience. It hadn't even started with Eliza's return. Someone had anticipated both. And someone had moved early. She requested to see the estate's guest request log again, specifically those who were invited on Lord Haverton's letterhead. There, among the lines of expected dignitaries and distant cousins, one name stood out, an addendum written hastily in the margin, include Miss Evelyn Marsh, guest of family. Initialed L.H., but faintly off. Miss Marple read the name twice. Marsh. She stepped into the hall and asked the inspector if any guests had left under that name. The answer came quickly, none. She turned to Lord Haverton, who had spent the day buried in paperwork. Did you invite a Miss Evelyn Marsh? He looked puzzled. No, never heard of her. But the name matched another entry, an earlier one, in the St. Helena ledger. Marsh was listed as a recipient of a secondary transfer, a beneficiary. She asked one more question. Who had authorized the musician contracts? This time, Lord Haverton grew still. Griggs insisted on handling them. He said he'd secured a string quartet personally, and the guest credentials. He left that to the steward. Miss Marple stood quietly, then said, I'd like to speak with Eliza, alone. She found her in the solarium, back turned, staring out at the grey garden beyond the glass. Her posture hadn't changed much since her rescue, still watchful, still guarded. Eliza, Miss Marple said gently, did your mother ever mention a name like Marsh? Evelyn, perhaps? Eliza's brow furrowed, the name rolling across her mind. She had a friend, Evelyn, from the clinic. They used to sit together during the recovery sessions. She sent us a letter after the funeral, but my father burned it. What did the letter say? I don't know. But I remember the handwriting. She signed it with a small flower drawn at the bottom. Miss Marple returned to the guest registry and searched the documents again. At the corner of the page, listing Evelyn Marsh's room assignment, now marked vacant, a tiny flower had been sketched. She sat with the weight of it for a long moment. Then she rose, walked to the steward's records, and flipped through the personnel files. Evelyn Marsh wasn't listed among the guests officially, nor among the musicians, nor the kitchen staff, but she was listed once, under a pseudonym. Ava Martin, temporary house attendant, ball week only. Miss Marple looked up sharply. The guest who had never arrived. The staff member no one remembered seeing. The musician who signed the waltz sheet with E.M. They were all the same woman. She summoned the inspector, her voice steady despite what she now suspected. Evelyn Marsh was never a guest. She entered as staff, as a musician, and as an agent of vengeance. She's the one who orchestrated the timing, paid Morris, and designed the murder. She used Griggs's infrastructure, Mirren's drugs, and Devlin's anger. But she was the one who saw it all coming. She was the one who built it. The inspector blinked. But why? Miss Marple opened the final letter from the cello case. It had been overlooked in the rush. Folded, sealed but unsigned. It read, You buried them with numbers. You called them trials. You called it necessary. But we remember the screams. You called them failures. But we called them family. You are not forgiven. Not you. not the ones who helped. I was 12. I remember everything. There was no name, no threat, just a reckoning. Miss Marple handed it to the inspector. This wasn't about money or power. It wasn't even about revenge in the usual sense. Evelyn Marsh was a survivor, a child witness to one of Lionel's early human trials, perhaps on her own mother, perhaps on herself. She lived through it, and she waited, years, decades, until the right moment came. But the others, Griggs, Mirren, she didn't need them to trust her. She needed them to follow their patterns. She knew they'd cover things up. She knew they'd hide the crime once it happened. She didn't have to kill Lionel with her own hands. She just had to light the match and let them add fuel to the fire. The inspector stood very still. Then she's still out there. She may be watching even now, Miss Marple said. And if we don't find her, she'll strike again, not for Lionel's sake, but for the others, for every patient who vanished, for every file Griggs shredded, for every bottle Mirren signed off on. She didn't kill to silence the past. She killed to make it scream. There was a long silence. And in it, the storm outside finally broke into thunder. The storm had moved from drizzle to sheets of rain, hammering against the windows with a fury that made every floorboard creak underfoot, as if the house itself was responding to the truth, now clawing its way into daylight. The inspector doubled the guard at every exit, sealed the perimeter, and sent urgent descriptions to every nearby village and town. Evelyn Marsh had vanished like smoke, but Miss Marple knew she hadn't gone far. Not yet. She hadn't come for the murder alone. She had come for the reckoning, and that meant she was still waiting for the final piece to fall. Miss Marple sat in the solarium with Lord Haverton, Eliza, and Dr. Mirren. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows across their faces as they each turned over what they now knew. Lord Haverton had grown pale, shaken not by guilt. He was innocent of the darkest schemes, but by how easily they had bloomed beneath his roof. Dr. Mirren, though not formally charged, wore the stiffness of a man condemned by his own conscience. And Eliza, silent as ever, stared down at her clasped hands with the calm of someone who had lived in storms long enough to know this one was nearing its end. Then Miss Marple stood and made her request. "We need to gather everyone in the ballroom," she said. "Tonight. One final time." The inspector hesitated, uncertain. She could already be gone. Miss Marple turned to him gently. "She's not. She's waiting, watching. She wants the truth seen, all of it. If we bring them together, she'll come. It's the only way she'll allow this to end." And so, by evening, the grand ballroom was reopened. The chairs had been returned, the chandelier lit, casting its flickering glow over the wooden floor where Lionel had danced his final steps. Guests were summoned, back under the pretense of resolution. Some came in disbelief, others in exhausted curiosity. The remaining staff stood along the edges, unsure of what role they played anymore. Dr. Mirren arrived alone. Eliza, seated in the back, kept her eyes on the shadows. And Miss Marple, standing at the centre, waited with the patience only age and absolute certainty could give. She addressed the room without preamble. "Many of you have already heard the name Evelyn Marsh. Few of you remember her. That was by design. She worked behind the scenes, slipped in and out of documents and positions, took the names that were available, and discarded them when they no longer served. But she didn't kill out of chaos. She did it with purpose, The inspector watched her carefully from the side, his hand near his coat pocket. She orchestrated Sir Lionel's death, Miss Marple continued, not to avenge a single loss, but to expose a legacy of suffering buried in financial reports and medical records. She used each of you to do it. Griggs's greed, Mirren's shame, Devlin's resentment, and made sure the blame would pass among you like a shared secret. A murmur rippled through the guests. She was here that night, not as Evelyn Marsh, but as Ava Martin, the house attendant, the one no one saw, but who saw everything. She gave the wax to Griggs, planted the figure with the steward, waited until the ballroom swelled with sound, and made her way to the study corridor just as the final waltz began. Miss Marple looked around the room. She is here now. The room froze. A chair creaked. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the back of the hall. A woman stepped forward. She wore a black coat and gloves, her hair pinned tightly beneath a plain cap. She looked neither shaken nor angry. Her expression was one of stillness, almost quiet relief. "You remembered the flower," she said, her voice low. Miss Marple nodded. "It was always about memory, wasn't it?" Evelyn glanced briefly at Eliza. "We were both children when it happened. You forgot the sound. I remembered it." The inspector took a cautious step forward. "Miss Marsh, I'm not armed," she said, lifting her hands calmly. "I didn't come here to run. I came here to show you what he built, and what they helped him hide." Dr. Mirren shifted behind her, but she didn't look at him. "You murdered Sir Lionel," the inspector said. "You paid a killer to deliver a death so precise it would evade every eye in the room." "No," she replied softly. "I built the design. I wrote the formula, but I didn't pay the killer. I was the killer." Silence dropped like a curtain. "You played cello," Miss Marple said. "I trained for 2 years, enough to pass unnoticed. Griggs secured my position. He thought he was hiring Morris. I made sure his contact used the wrong name. I carried my own case. And after the waltz, I slipped from the stage to the study. Lionel had just left Lady Devlin. I greeted him. He didn't recognize me. He never would." "And the wax?" asked the inspector, already inside his coat. He felt it warm and reached for it. It cut him before he understood. "I left him by the fire, closed the door, walked back on stage in time for the last bow." The words came with no tremor, no pride, no regret. Miss Marple asked, "Why now?" "Because he was going to confess. Not to the public, not to the courts, to his priest. He thought that would be enough, that dying clean would absolve him. He wanted peace. And I couldn't let him have it." The inspector stepped forward. "You'll come with us, quietly." "I plan to," she said. "I've been waiting for this. But why not simply expose him? Leak the files, go to the press." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "They would have buried it again, said it was fiction, or revenge. I needed you to see it. I needed the world to hear the story from your mouths, and now they will." She removed her gloves slowly and handed them to the inspector. As the constable stepped in to escort her out, Miss Marple watched her go without judgment. Evelyn didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't look back. Eliza stood finally from her seat. "She didn't kill him because he ruined her life," she whispered. "She killed him because he believed he hadn't." Miss Marple nodded, her voice barely audible. "And that," she said, "was the one truth he never prepared for." The ballroom emptied slowly, the guests moving in reverent silence, as if they had just witnessed the closing act of a long and tragic play. The storm still lashed at the windows, but no one spoke of it. All eyes had been on Evelyn Marsh, now taken into custody with calm surrender, her words lingering in the air like smoke. The weight of her confession settled across the estate like dust. The motive had been uncovered, the killer revealed. The case, at last, seemed closed, and yet Miss Marple remained in the ballroom long after the chairs were cleared and the chandeliers dimmed. She stood before the fireplace where Sir Lionel had sat on that final night, studying the ironwork, the slight scorch on the rug, the imprint in the wood where his shoe had pressed for the last time. The storm outside had begun to ease, but something within her had not. It wasn't disbelief. It was dissonance. Evelyn Marsh had done everything with ruthless intention, that much was clear. Her knowledge of the wax weapon, the medical formula, the orchestration of the murder, all of it pointed to her. And yet there was something out of tune. A single note still unresolved in a symphony she had believed concluded. She returned once more to the vault with the inspector's reluctant permission. The ledgers sat where they had been, the same columns, the same initials, but this time she ignored the big numbers. She searched for something smaller, quieter, almost invisible, and then she found it. A single line, a small transfer, marked not to Evelyn Marsh, nor to any alias she had used, but to a private courier, one hired 3 days before the winter ball. The transfer had been ordered under the initials L.H. Miss Marple stood motionless. Lord Haverton. It couldn't be. He had seemed genuinely shocked, genuinely horrified. But the signature was real, and the date was precise. The courier company's records confirmed it. They had delivered one sealed case to a local luthier, instrument repair. No return address. She requested a quiet word with Lord Haverton. He met her in the drawing room with an expression of weary civility. "I thought it was over," he said. "It almost is," she replied gently. She placed the document on the table. "I need you to tell me why you paid for a courier 3 days before the winter ball." His brow creased, but the lines around his eyes didn't match the confusion he tried to wear. "For Sir Lionel, I assume. He often sent things for private repair, books, tools. This was for a cello case," she said. He froze. "I imagine you had your reasons," Miss Marple continued, "but I've reviewed the repair shop's records. The case wasn't repaired. It was modified, reinforced, hollowed at the center. The man you hired didn't know what it would be used for, just that it had to pass as authentic and carry weight without inspection." Haverton sat down slowly. "She did everything," he said. "I never thought she'd actually succeed." Then, "Why help her?" He looked at her, finally without pretense. "Because he ruined everything. He bled this estate dry, disguised it as success, and turned our family name into a ledger of bribes. Evelyn wasn't the only one who watched her family fall apart. Mine fell too, quietly, elegantly, like polite shame always does." Miss Marple remained still. "I knew who she was when she arrived," he said. "I recognized her name when she applied for service under her alias. I let her in. I made it easy. I didn't plan the murder, but I cleared the path. You could have stopped her. She would have found another way. And He trailed off. "I didn't care any more if Lionel lived. Only if the estate survived him." "And now?" she asked softly. "Now it's over. My name. the estate, everything. She said nothing. The silence stretched. "I suppose," he said finally, "this is the moment I'm meant to turn myself in." "That's up to the inspector," she said, "but I think you've already sentenced yourself." That night, the inspector received Miss Marple's quiet report, written in her delicate script. It didn't accuse Lord Haverton of murder. It didn't accuse him of conspiracy. It simply stated the facts. He had enabled access. He had removed obstacles. He had knowingly allowed a killer to pass through the cracks he claimed not to see. The law might find that insufficient. But the truth was whole now. Evelyn Marsh had crafted the weapon. Griggs had delivered the distraction. Mirren had prepared the conditions. But Lord Haverton had left the door open. And in the end, it wasn't one mastermind behind the murder. It was a house full of ghosts, each one too proud, too silent, or too broken to stop what they all saw coming. When Miss Marple returned to her room, she finally folded away her knitting. The storm outside had passed. The house no longer whispered. But she knew better than to believe silence ever meant peace. Not in houses like these, not where secrets were built into the walls. The days that followed passed not with triumph, but with a hush of reckoning. The grandeur of Grangewood Hall was no longer impressive. It had become a monument to silence and complicity. The guests who remained trickled away quietly. Some never looked back. Others, like Eliza, stayed a while longer, not because they wished to, but because something in them needed to witness what came next. Evelyn Marsh had confessed and was now being held in a secure facility under heavy scrutiny, but her face remained calm when questioned, her voice steady, as though she had already made peace with her actions long before the world caught up to them. She answered every question without fear. There was no need to hide any more. But as Miss Marple had feared, the case had not resolved itself with a tidy verdict. Griggs was being formally charged as a co-conspirator, thanks to the money trail and the steward's testimony. Dr. Mirren was to be disbarred from practice and likely prosecuted for medical malpractice tied to the St. Helena experiments. Lord Haverton, however, had not been charged at all. His name had been quietly removed from the guest registries and reports before the first article even made it to print. The inspector did not say why, but Miss Marple suspected the answer was as old as the house itself: reputation. He had assisted, yes, but his distance from the murder itself had given him cover. That, and the fact that Evelyn had refused to name him. In her statement, she never once mentioned his involvement. Her silence, Miss Marple believed, was deliberate, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps pity, or perhaps because Evelyn knew the price he would pay would not come from the law, but from the empty rooms and the years of slow decline that now awaited him. Eliza came to Miss Marple on the morning of her departure. They sat beneath the frost-veiled windows in the drawing-room, sunlight filtering through the glass with a muted silver hue. "Do you think it was worth it?" Eliza asked. "What she did?" Miss Marple took a long breath before answering. "Justice rarely looks the way we imagine it will. It's not always a gavel. Sometimes it's a shadow cast long after the act. Evelyn didn't want revenge. She wanted the world to remember, and she made sure they would. But she'll go to prison. She expected that. What she did was deliberate. She didn't run because she didn't believe she was wrong." Eliza nodded slowly, then looked at the fire. "You knew before anyone that it wasn't just Evelyn." "I suspected," Miss Marple said softly. There were too many hands touching the crime without leaving fingerprints. But one clue stayed with me. She reached into her bag and pulled out the now crumpled event program from the winter ball. "Do you remember this?" Eliza nodded. "The dance card." Each guest was issued one. Lionel's had been altered. Lady Devlin's name had been added last minute. At first, I thought that meant she was part of the plot, but she wasn't. The person who altered the card wasn't part of the dance. It was someone watching the order of movements. Someone who needed Lionel to be in the study at the precise moment the wax melted. She pointed to the faint smudge on the back of the card. This ink wasn't Lionel's. It was the same shade used on the seating chart, the courier records, and the guest list itself. Lord Haverton's ink. Eliza didn't speak. He tried to make it look like Lionel had chosen Lady Devlin, but it was a setup. He timed it all to align with the orchestra's pause. Because Evelyn's plan depended on more than precision, it depended on Lionel believing he had full control right up to the moment he lost it. Eliza finally looked at her. "But why didn't you tell the inspector?" Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "I did. But justice isn't always about what the inspector can prove. It's about what a man has to live with. Lord Haverton must sit in this house now and know that the truth didn't save him. It exposed him. His punishment is here, where the walls remember." They stood together then, and Miss Marple watched as Eliza turned toward the doorway, her shoulders straighter than before. There was a resolve in her now, something quiet but unshakable. She wasn't healed, but she was whole. Before leaving the estate, Miss Marple made one final visit to the study. She knelt by the fireplace and brushed her fingers against the floorboards, where the last ashes of the night Lionel died had long since gone cold.
This but as a remainder, in the end, Evelyn Marsh had not escaped. She had simply stepped into the consequences she had designed for herself.
Faced such clarity, Lord Haverton remained in his estate, his title intact, but the corridors whispered behind him now. Guests stopped coming, invitations went unanswered. And the house, proud and grand as it was, had become too quiet for him to sleep through the night. Evelyn's final move had not been the murder. It had been ensuring that every hand that touched the crime could no longer pretend they hadn't. That was the real trap, and Miss Marple had seen it from the start. The wax, the wound, the confession, those had been clever. But it was the pattern of silence, the pattern of names left off guest lists, of payments just beneath scrutiny, of staff who had no memory of someone they served. That was where the truth lived. As she boarded her train home, knitting once again, in hand, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile. There were no heroes in this story, but there was, at last, no one left to lie. As Miss Marple boarded the train back to St. Mary Mead, the rolling countryside passing by in a blur, she felt the peculiar weight of finality settle over her. The case had been solved. Grief had been avenged, secrets unearthed, justice, as much as it could be served, delivered. The estate had returned to silence, the house now carrying the burden of its own history, its own shadows. But, as always, she was left with something more, something just beyond the surface of the solved mystery, like a half-forgotten tune that lingers even after the last note has faded. The problem, of course, was that she couldn't quite shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There had been too many small, unnoticed details, things that were still nagging her thoughts, the wax, the pattern, the payments that had trickled through the cracks in Lionel's ledger, the strange presence of a name that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Even now, as the train clicked along the tracks, she found herself piecing together the moments when things had seemed just a little off, when the story had twisted in ways she hadn't fully understood at the time. Her knitting needles clicked in rhythm, the yarn slipping quietly through her fingers as she thought back to that single fleeting detail, the tear in the envelope Lionel had sent. It had been subtle, almost unnoticeable, but the scrawl on the back had always been too hurried. It had looked like a last-minute instruction, a warning, a message meant for someone else. The letter to Lord Haverton had mentioned the trial and erasure in a way that suggested Lionel knew far more than he ever let on. But the real question, the one she couldn't quite answer, was this. What had Lionel been so desperate to protect? She had thought the case closed, thought the pattern revealed, but now she was not so certain. Could it be that Lionel's secrets had been buried too deeply for them to truly be unearthed? Could there be someone still out there watching the pieces of this story shift in the dark? Her fingers paused, the knitting falling still in her lap. Something didn't sit right. There had been something in Lord Haverton's words, his final look of confusion as the case closed, that had seemed too genuine, too perplexed. He had feigned ignorance. But had he really been unaware of the full depth of what Lionel had been involved in? Or had he simply hidden his own role too well, even from himself? The truth, as Miss Marple had learned many times before, was rarely a simple path. It twisted and turned in ways that, once fully revealed, made the rest of the world seem laughably transparent. But this felt like a deeper web, a mystery that could have been solved if only the right thread had been pulled at the right moment. But she hadn't known to look for it. The train lurched as it rounded a bend, and Miss Marple sat up straighter, the thought returning to her. The letter in Lionel's study had contained far more than a warning about his demise. It was a plea, a silent admission of guilt. He had known too much. But who had been willing to go so far to silence him? The more she thought about it, the more her mind raced toward a conclusion she hadn't yet dared to confront. Was it possible that Evelyn Marsh had not been the sole force behind it all? Could it be that another player had been watching from the periphery, letting the situation unfold just so? Someone who, in their quest for the final piece, had waited until the perfect moment to strike? Her thoughts raced to the names, the players she had examined so carefully. Griggs, Mirren, Haverton. Even Eliza, who had seemed so distant in the wake of it all, had a part to play. But it was something about the way Lord Haverton had stepped back, letting the investigation unfold as it did, that felt wrong. Something about his reluctance to confront the mess of his own past, his careful denial of his connection to the estate's darkest dealings, suggested a man more involved than he had let on. And that letter, it had all the hallmarks of someone on the verge of a confession. Lionel had planned to expose something, to make everything public. But who was he trying to protect with that final warning? His own family, his legacy. Miss Marple felt a twinge of frustration. She had done what she could, had unravelled the most pressing secrets, but the missing pieces, the fragments that remained unconnected, gnawed at her. The case wasn't over, not really. Not until she had all the answers, and she was certain, with the quiet confidence she had carried with her for years, that there were still hidden paths she hadn't yet discovered. Her train ride, once peaceful, now felt like a journey deeper into the labyrinth of a mystery that still had too many rooms left to explore. As the train neared the next station, Miss Marple reached into her bag and retrieved the worn letter from Sir Lionel. The ink was faded now, the words almost blurred, but the urgency was still clear. She stared at the final cryptic line. "You took more than money. You took a future." Who had taken it? Who had destroyed the future he had fought so hard to keep? Hidden? The train hissed as it slowed to a stop, the next station drawing closer. Miss Marple didn't move at first. She was still thinking, still pulling at the threads that didn't quite connect, the questions that remained unanswered. The door to the compartment opened and the conductor's voice cut through her thoughts. "Miss Marple, we've arrived." With one last look at the letter, Miss Marple placed it back in her bag. She stood, smoothed her dress, and walked down the aisle of the train with purpose. The case was far from over, and there was something just out of reach, something that, if she didn't find it soon, would keep the truth just beyond her grasp. And she couldn't leave it there. Not yet. As she stepped onto the platform, the rain had stopped, and the clouds had begun to break, letting in the first slivers of sunlight. Miss Marple took a deep breath and felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on her, a quiet reminder that the story wasn't done. Not until she had all the pieces, not until the last thread had been pulled and the pattern was finally complete. The mystery never truly ended. It just waited, patiently, silently, for the right moment to reveal itself, and Miss Marple would be waiting too.